Welcome to the final seminar of our series of COVID-19 research presentations from the College of Arts and Sciences at Western Michigan University. Today's a special day, not just because of this seminar, but it's also Giving Day at the university, an opportunity for friends of the university to help support research like you're going to hear about today, as well as the students that are often involved in these projects. With the COVID-19 pandemic, institutions of higher education were forced into the rapid move to online instruction. Unexpectedly to most, this online presence continued into the summer, then fall, then spring and beyond. Even instruction that eventually came back in person was fundamentally changed. All of these challenges and changes are likely to have significant downstream effects, not only for educational environments, but to standards of instruction. From accrediting bodies for entire university to those for specific disciplines, all have had to consider how their models will bend or be remade to accommodate the new instructional realities. The implications for students and institutions are significant. The COVID-19 crisis, along with recent legislative actions, are forcing accreditors to consider radical adjustments to models of assessment in higher education. This is challenging the traditional boundaries of credit-bearing programs and degree requirements. Dr. James Cousins, Master Faculty Specialist of History and Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences, and Wessam Abdelaziz, a graduate student in Evaluation, Measurement, and Research, addressed this question in real time. In this webinar, Dr. Cousins will discuss the findings of a rigorous year-long study into the implications of the COVID-19 crisis on accrediting bodies and, more generally, how these impacts will influence higher education for years to come. He will be presenting the COVID-19 crisis, accreditation, and the future of higher learning.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is James Cousins. I'm Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences here at Western Michigan University. And joining me today is my co-PI, Wessam Abdelaziz, a PhD candidate in Western's Educational Leadership, Research, and Technology program. Our thanks go out to Dr. Kinsey, the Office of Research and Innovation, and the Meter Presidential Grant Review Team for this opportunity. The purpose of this project is to understand how accreditors of higher education responded to the COVID-19 outbreak and how these responses might shape the future of higher education. This is important because accreditation helps, to some degree, shape the boundaries of what is possible in higher education. And as we've learned throughout this series, COVID-19 was a clarifying event, and that it helped organizations better understand their essential functions as they relate to their core missions. Higher education is still writing the history of COVID's impact on higher education, and in this process, we've already accumulated a mass of published reports, webinars, survey data, and opinion pieces on everything from online learning to athletics and student supports. But Wessam and I were interested to see if short-term policies adopted in the wake of COVID by accreditors might have long-term impacts. We also wanted to use this as an opportunity to explore another major recent event in accreditation, the removal of geographical limitations on the 7 regional accreditors. The Higher Learning Commission, Middle States, Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, and others are the major accreditors of traditional brick-and-mortar campuses. They were, as I'll discuss, once limited to distinct geographical boundaries, but per a November 2019 policy, U.S. Department of Education removed these boundaries and now allows regional accreditors to accredit anywhere in the U.S. This is another change that, along with COVID-19, might take accreditors in interesting directions. The commingled impact of COVID-19 and deregulation may bring profound changes to the accreditation landscape, and along with those changes, fundamental alterations to the basic premises of modern higher education. Our project is at the end of the first of 2 phases. In phase 1, we used a sequential mixed methods approach. This required collecting and analyzing qualitative data from interviews. We'll use our findings to inform phase 2, which will center around quantitative data collection. We began phase 1 research with content analysis of relevant literature. This gave the basis for informal interviewing of accreditors. The combination of the two then scaffolded interview protocol. We concentrated on all the former regionals and representatives from other accreditation organizations, soliciting presidents and executive level members who play strategic decision-making roles within those organizations. Interviews were guided by 4 open-ended questions with some coordinating prompts. How has your organization adapted to the COVID-19 crisis? What, in your opinion, will be the long-term impact of COVID on accreditation? Where do you see the future of accreditation? And for the former regional accreditors, we asked, will the Department of Education's new negotiated rule allowing regional accreditors to accredit nationally impact your organization? Interview transcripts were coded, labeled, and grouped by emergent themes. For the coding, we used InVivo, a qualitative analysis software. And you can see the variety of ways InVivo helps organize and graphically demonstrate intertextual themes. The themes we uncovered and will discuss today deal with communication, an appreciation for the virtual space, the essentials of higher education, and an accelerated rate of change within organizations. Because some of the ideas that I'll present today assume a baseline understanding of accreditation, I'd like to start with a very brief primer on accreditation and the accreditation process. First, what is accreditation? Accreditation signifies the validity and quality of academic institutions and programs. Accreditation is the end result of a process organized and implemented by independent agencies that review institutions or programs against standards for quality. Typically, an institution will experience accreditation as a periodic and reoccurring event through reviews or reaffirmations. These reviews are rigorous and comprehensive. Institutions take many months and dedicate many hours of many staff to prepare all the documentation necessary. Accrediting site team visits, typically made up of volunteers from similar institutions, then review these documents as part of their equally comprehensive review. Unlike other countries where institutions are sanctioned, licensed, or otherwise officially recognized to do business directly by an arm of the government, in the United States, the Department of Education commissions independent oversight bodies to regularly review institutions to ensure quality standards. All U.S. accreditors are officially recognized by either the U.S. Department of Education, or USDE, the Council for Higher Education Accreditation, CHIA, or both, and in many cases both. USDE recognition is necessary for tax-exempt status and for participation in the federal government's Title IV student aid programs. CHIA and or USDE recognition may also be necessary for transfer of academic credit, entry into certain graduate programs, professional licensure, and even some vocations. But accreditation is also important for another reason. It gives colleges and universities a framework for how higher education should function. First, by setting minimum qualifications for faculty, student supports, and ethical conduct. But more importantly, accreditors define the terms and set the boundaries for the entire enterprise. The use of data-informed decision-making, internal review policies, research supports, and the roles and responsibilities of board members are just some of the things accreditors use to create structures and boundaries. 7 regional institutional accreditors, formerly known as regional accreditors, now national accreditors, make up the most visible accreditation authorities. The largest among them are the Higher Learning Commission, or HLC, which accredits Western Michigan University, and the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, or SACS. Other national accreditors also sanctioned by USDE and CHIA include faith-based institutional accreditors and distance learning accreditors. Programmatic accreditors make up the largest share of accrediting organizations. This is everything from Accreditation Council for Pharmacy Education to the National Association of Schools of Dance, and there are upwards of 79 accreditors of this type. Every interview subject was ensured of anonymity, and the data presented here today is in the aggregate so as to further protect that identity. Again, the data was collected in interviews, coded in InVivo, and then themes emerged as a result. We'll be discussing each theme sequentially and end each with conjecture about what this might mean for institutions of higher education. We'll begin with communication. All of the accrediting bodies I interviewed talked about enhanced communications with their institutions and programs. This often took the form of intensified push messaging, with more frequent emails to their institutions and notices posted to a COVID webpage on an organization's website. but it also took the form of more intentional dialoguing with institutions through surveying, individual consultations, focus groups, blogs, podcasts, and large open forums. This was all done in order to push out information, but also to understand the unique pressures faced by their institutions and programs. Accreditors saw this enhanced communication strategy as an advantage, but also noticed this is something new in the world of accreditation. Most expressed interest in moving in the direction of collaboration or even partnerships with their institutions in the near and long term. It's not hard to see the value of this more participatory structure. First, it helps de-stress accreditation. And one accreditor said that pre-COVID, it was almost taboo for a program to ask a question of an accreditor out of fear that they would be found non-compliant. This is similar to asking the IRS if you can claim your golf membership as a deduction on your taxes. The fear would be that they would come back and say, no, and what other deductions have you claimed? An accreditor's acceptance of questions of all sort led to more questions and helped inspire an environment of trust. Furthermore, the more accreditors are willing to listen to institutions, the more they may be willing to accommodate individual needs. Accreditors have been long critiqued for a one-size-fits-all approach, where institutions and programs of various sizes, scopes, and missions are lumped together and assessed with the same standards and approaches. A two-way communications link is helpful if it leads to greater levels of accessibility from an institution's perspective and adaptability from an accreditor's. And one major accreditor told me that, quote, adaptation is a critical part of how we do what we do. If this is true, expect to see accreditors making some fundamental changes in the years ahead. Let's now talk about the changes in the virtual environment. As you might imagine, travel restrictions and campus closures pushed accreditors to reconsider their approaches to campus visits. Pre-COVID, campus visits lasted anywhere from a few days to a week and could include teams as large as a dozen reviewers. The shift to virtual visits helped clarify just how important those on-campus experiences were, why they were so necessary, and how they could be modified by a larger reliance on technology. Accreditors spoke about the greater participation of faculty, staff, and students of host institutions in a virtual environment, while also noting that the dynamic was different and less effective than an in-person dialogue. However, by and large, accreditors felt that virtual evaluation visits were more effective in an online format. Travel was no longer an issue, so peer reviewers had more time to do the work of evaluation. Another accreditor told me that the virtual environment, quote, caused them to focus a lot more. The cost savings are also obvious and hard to ignore. Airfare, lodging, food, and per diem add up quickly for the accreditation site team. International travel can easily run into the 6 digits. These costs are always borne by the host institution, and accreditors are sensitive to these cost pressures. USDE still maintains a one-day visit requirement, and accreditors have adjusted by creating new policies and procedures, the most common of which is the use of learning management systems or online portals, which institutions can use to upload documents well in advance of their review. Reviewers can then access this during an extended review window. At the very least, there is sure to be a blended format that comes out of the pandemic. The additional time for reviewers could translate into additional scrutiny, which then, in turn, might surface issues that might have gone unnoticed in a traditional on-campus review. Along with the shift to virtual site visits was a shift to virtual training of peer reviewers. Accreditors require training for their volunteers before their campus visits, initial training on standards and practices, and additional refresher trainings for experienced volunteers. Traditionally, these were almost always in person, usually at the accreditor's headquarters. Again, campus closures and travel restrictions forced accreditors to rethink standard practice, and all site team trainings went online. Some accreditors had already incorporated certain virtual learning components in their strategies, but many had to create training programs out of whole cloth. This was an opportunity for accreditors to actually review their training programs for the first time, and quite a few were unimpressed by what they found. For many accreditors, training materials now live online, with an expectation that they'll be refreshed and improved periodically. There are obvious benefits here in terms of cost, but also in standardization of learning. As with site visits, you're reducing team building opportunities, but you're increasing the intensity of the review. But again, for many accreditors, this was the first time they had critically reviewed their training. One accreditor said, quote, "We were never able to understand what we were trying to communicate. Now we do." Trainings are now longer and more comprehensive. A 2 or 3 day training program might now be stretched to as many as 4 weeks of self-paced work. In this way, accreditors are able to deliver more information and expect better retention of that information. Again, this may result in more thorough evaluations and a greater scrutiny of institutions. Accreditors also now understand the essentials of higher education in a new light. Over the years, certain program standards became more rigorous or more intense, in many cases just to make them more rigorous or more intense. By their own admission, accreditors tend to increase hours spent in clinical practice or in the classroom, but without a return on the investment of time, either in state licensure exam passage rates or other discernible measures of student success. COVID made many of these additional out-of-class obligations impossible. It was hard enough to get students into the hospital as it was, so institutions had to scale back hour requirements in their clinical rotations. Similarly, restrictions on pass-fail grades were lifted across the board. Many programs, graduate programs in particular, were given a temporary waiver, and many are asking if those waivers shouldn't just become revised policies and made permanent. Residency requirements are another area. Some accreditors require a certain number of hours to be completed on campus. These were put on hold by some accreditors so individual schools could offer distance education. It's now an open question if these requirements should return. Along these same lines, accreditors are moving towards guiding principles rather than practices. So rather than having separate standards for distance education and on-campus learning, many have created or are in the process of creating principles that account for quality in all programs. This has all brought clarity to accreditors in a way arguments for college affordability or access never could. But the results will benefit the whole, and based on what we learned, accreditors and program accreditors in particular will be open to more economizing. Expect the trend to continue with allied health programs receiving the greatest revision. There are, however, a number of cases where the desire for greater efficiency or innovation in this area runs up against state licensing requirements, which have proven less malleable. And finally, the COVID pandemic proved to accreditors that rapid, large-scale organizational change wasn't just possible, it was often less difficult than they expected. Accreditors were pushed to adapt quickly to a shifting landscape while they carried out business as usual. You saw this most acutely when USDE granted a waiver for schools to go 100% remote last March. Accreditors scrambled to reorganize everything and succeeded. But there were dozens of examples accreditors shared about pre-COVID decisions that took a year or more pre-pandemic that were now, in the early weeks of the pandemic, made within days. The head of one program accreditation organization said that the pandemic, quote, facilitated and operationalized things that he wanted to do as a leader, things that he had on his wish list for a long-range plan, expecting them to take 5 to 10 years to accomplish, but took less than a year. This is where accreditors exhibited some real leadership, streamlining their decision-making processes, but also giving proof to the claim that they were listening and responding to their institutions. Many accreditors felt empowered by how nimble and adaptable their organizations were, and this will have real consequences. It may, for example, translate into further, more dynamic changes in structures and policies, for instance. Accreditors want to play a role in promoting equity, diversity, inclusion, and affordability on college campuses. Ideas and plans on how to do this will almost certainly accelerate and become policy in the coming years. In Phase 1, the whole became greater than the sum of its parts, and accreditors' perspectives on COVID-inspired changes are helpful for another reason altogether. When I asked accreditors about the future of higher education, they had some interesting things to say because they have both a specific and global perspective. They talked about micro-credentials, stackable degrees, and credit for prior learning, but more often they pointed to individual examples of programs and institutions that were stretching the boundaries. This, as we've seen, is something you should expect from organizations that now pride themselves on their direct communication links with their institutions, their ready adaptability to shifting demands, and more dynamic processes led by renewed respect for virtual environments. And this might be the single greatest takeaway from Phase 1. When the Middle States Commission accredited the 100% online Western Governors University, when the Distance Education Accrediting Council accredited University of the People, a tuition-free 100% online university, or when the New England Commission on Higher Education, the same accreditor that accredits Harvard, Cornell, and Brown, accredited College Unbound, which is an institution that operates without full-time faculty or a physical campus, they gave evidence to their promotion of innovation. Other examples of institutions stretching the limits of accreditation abound. Many of us see demand for innovation from students, industry, and the government, and what I'd like to emphasize here is the support for innovation among accreditors. But it's more than just support. I'd argue that accreditors are looking for ways to inspire innovation at the institutional level. Innovation should be part of an institution's operational model. It's important for colleges and universities to dedicate resources to these ends, but also to develop a heightened awareness and appreciation for the breadth of programs, models, collaborations, pedagogies, supports, and cultures that have succeeded nationwide. This demands a coordinated and campus-wide effort. Innovation was important pre-pandemic and will be essential post-pandemic, when the greatest challenges facing higher education, heightened competition, demographic shifts, rapid technological change, rising costs, and enhanced public scrutiny, will be taken up again. These problems and a galaxy of emerging unknowns will require forward-looking, innovative solutions. Phase 2 will continue to probe the themes uncovered in Phase 1, but through a quantitative lens and from an institutional perspective. We'll be asking public and private colleges and universities if their accreditors' understanding of the major themes uncovered here match their reality. And there are many uses of the end result. Parity might confirm the efforts of accreditors. Disconnect might signal a growing unease regarding the relationship between accreditor and institution. One of the things we'll be looking for is the extent to which institutions believe their choice of national accreditors, and remember now that it is a choice, is their best option going forward. Thank you, and Wessam and I will now take your questions.
Welcome to the question and answer session, and I'd like to thank Dr. Cousins and Mr. Abdelaziz for their contributions to this important work. Just a note for some of you that may not be aware, on Monday and Tuesday of this week, Western Michigan University was undergoing its own virtual and partially in-person site visit by the Higher Learning Commission, so this work could not be more timely. At this point, I'll be looking to your questions that are in the chat in YouTube, as well as some other questions that have come up based on this work. So sorry, low feedback there. I'd like to start with a question from our YouTube chat, which is to talk about what is the accreditation audit schedule like? So how much, sort of an idea of the workload that you've been talking about here, how much communication is there before the audit, how many site visits a year, and how much time for full review? So what does this workload really look like?
Well, I'll jump in, and thank you so much again for this opportunity. Really appreciate it. It was a really interesting project that took a little over a year actually to put together, and Wessam and I are just thrilled to be here. But to answer the question is difficult because of the nature of the project, which is so aggregated, and we took programmatic accreditors, the national and the former regional accreditors, and pooled them together. The question is a good one, but it varies depending on what accrediting body you're looking at. Typically, there are, from the institution's perspective, the ramp up is within the year leading up to an accreditation site visit or more, but certainly mechanisms are in place prior to that and ongoing, some permanent. And again, depending on if it's a programmatic or an institutional accreditation visit. Now, the institutional accreditor or programmatic accreditor coming to campus and what sort of forewarning and sort of preparation that they'll expect in their communications ahead of time. That really varies, but is typically upwards of 2 months to 3 months ahead of time, and then sort of intensifying over the course of those 2 or 3 months.
Thank you. Another question that's come in on the chat is asking about your sense regarding perceptions that it could be more advantageous to opt into one accrediting group versus another. Do you foresee one will become more popular, one less popular? What is the shopping going to look like? And can you imagine how it might be dealt with in terms of this workload issue? How much can any accreditor take on?
That's such an interesting question, and one that I think we'll know a lot more about in phase 2 from the accreditor's perspective. Certainly something that they're all eyeing, and they all sort of have an awakening understanding of, and that is on the horizon. And some accreditors are perhaps more and better equipped to deal with it than others, and some are looking on the horizon and sort of playing with the idea of what would it take to take on more and more institutions, and how they'd have to change fundamentally their organizations to handle that. And again, this is a challenge of some of the larger accreditation organizations out there that have upwards of 800, 900 plus institutions, how to onboard new institutions, what procedures to do that. So an initial accreditation phase of, say, like middle states will take around 5 years. And so could there be an expedited process for an already accredited institution? One thing that accreditors were universal on was their unwillingness to take on an institution that was on probation or had performed sort of less adequately with another accreditor. They were universal in that belief. But in terms of the fit of an institution, they're very receptive to the idea of an institution that's on one side of a boundary line between two different former regional boundaries, just sort of switching if it's the right fit in terms of the institution's size and scope and mission. And there are so many instances of that where it really would make sense just because of the accrediting organizations sort of their scope and what they do.
So we have a lot of interest in this topic about these geographical boundaries. And so one of the questions in the chat is, what is the history of these geographical boundaries and why were they originally imposed?
It's a rich history dating back over 100 years, and I would encourage anyone to kind of dig into that. I will say they were at one point more or less informal organizations, and the national accrediting bodies didn't just come into being sort of ex nihilo. They were sort of joint collaborative efforts on the part of institutions, and that these were formalized and made more rigid over time, and for many reasons, but they are long-standing.
And so as we're talking about accreditation, of course, we're talking about our students, which is first and foremost in our mind as a university. So I'd like to turn to Wessam and ask a question myself. We've been talking a lot about what's been learned about the topic. From your perspective, what's been learned about the methodology of doing this type of study, and how has this impacted your education in your field of evaluation?
Well, it has been great. Thank you for including me in this project and this conversation. It has been just an eye-opening experience on so many different levels, on a personal level, on a professional level, and everything, career, mentoring, and all that. So I would say the idea of accreditation itself, just the topic area, and being open and listen to leaders of accreditations and, people that I just read their names, and, as soon as you see accreditation, you get nervous and all that. Now you're hearing them, you're getting their perspective. So that was such a great experience for me as a student, just to get to listen to those leaders. In terms of the methodology, I would say, having this idea of mixed method that we are applying in our study is quite an experience, because usually in our training as students, we'll focus either on qualitative area or quant area. But what we're doing is we're doing this sequential method where we're starting with qualitative, and then the qualitative results will inform our quantitative phase 2, where we're building actually a survey, validating the survey, and testing a lot of other interesting quantitative things like factor analysis to see how it looks like, and how this tool will be validated to actually be utilized with many accreditors or even institutions to decide which accreditor they can go for when it comes to the idea of shopping, as you just mentioned earlier. So it has been a fascinating experience, to say the least.
That's great. We're really looking forward to phase 2. We've got another question here, which is, what do you see as the most important policy changes across higher ed that actually have been driven, whether it's recently or historically, by the accrediting agencies? So as opposed to just being an observer, how have they directed higher education in this country?
Well, I'll refer obviously to the most to the grant specifically and what we learned out of that, and I would say what they drew great attention to was their communication strategy and how that's been embedded. And that was sort of pre-existed COVID, but really intensified over the course of COVID, that communications channel, the direct surveying, the more active listening to institutions in their purview, and how that's informed every part of their organization. The other thing I'll say, obviously, is the switch to virtual, which I think has a newfound place of respect in an accreditor's toolkit. The switch to online learning has been something that we've known about in higher education for decades, but has really intensified and ramped up. And the experience of accreditors with virtual site visits has added, I think, a new level of legitimacy in a lot of cases to what what they expect from online learning. And how much accreditors see this as being just part of the permanent landscape of higher education, the possibilities there too. And then redirecting policies and procedures around those two. So active listening, for instance, connotes a variety of options and opportunities going forward. So that could mean sort of longer audit visits where communication starts earlier and ends later than a traditional cycle, and is shaped by institutions. And then the virtual environment also, I would expect that to be a permanent place, a permanent part in future accreditations. And that might not sound like an epiphany, but the cost savings alone would convince you that it's worthwhile. There's a lot that's missing in that virtual space. So the hallway conversations and the sidebars and just the overall kind of feel of what it is to be part of a group and synergizing and coming up with ideas and just conversing with others, developing collegial relationships within the accreditation visits themselves. And so there are some things that are just missing and synthetic. And then the development of site teams as well. The accreditation site teams missed out on those opportunities too, to go out to dinner with each other, to travel, and to experience a lot of the fun parts. And these are mostly volunteers who participate for just for travel experience, to visit other campuses, to bring things back to their home institutions. And so some of that is missing. Obviously, we all know, if you've been in an organization that's had to convert in real time to a virtual space, the kind of stilted nature of online communications and virtual spaces, and how one person and only one person, you kind of direct your attention there, and that can be intimidating to people, and it leads to some responses that may be authentic, but may be viewed as inauthentic. So they're adjusting overall. The question was about policy and procedures and changes, and I think the policies and procedures that you saw in the short term, how acceptable online learning is, that communications piece, really embedding that within their structures and their protocols, those will almost certainly continue, and I would expect be intensified in the years to come.
Well, I think I would speak for some of our students that are passionate about sustainability, that reducing travel also has a green impact, not just green financially. And I'd also say that the peer review that happens in the scientific community for grants, there's also a lot of discussion about whether some of this hybrid with virtual would allow us to have a more diverse team of reviewers, as people that have obligations to take care of family members can easily be underrepresented in such activities. So I think as we think about this, the impacts of virtual, they're not all negative, is what I think I'm hearing you say, both of you. So maybe we'll end here with a question about what are you looking to find in phase 2? What are sort of some of the findings you hope to be able to dig in deeper on, or things that you've added to your analysis that you'd like to come out of phase 2?
Wessam, if you'd like to begin, I can say some things, but if you want to get started.
Sure, yeah. So I would say that, as we said in the previous question about the method part, this is a sequential mixed method where our qualitative analysis, this is deep with a lot of emerging themes that were dropped together and merged together to form what we call categories or dimensions. So we started with the qualitative, and then we have the themes that Dr. Cousins just discussed. And from these themes, we aligned this with the theory of generative emergence. So our building of the instrument is theory-based, not just about the themes that we derived from the interviews. So we had the themes first, and then we also had the generative emergence, which has to do with change within institutions when they are affected by some sort of an event, in this case like COVID-19. So it's theory-based, number one. Number two, it is also driven by the qualitative themes. Now, this one, the idea that we have is, one of the ideas that we have is how, since we got the perspective of the leaders from institutions, from the accreditors, now would like also to hear from institutions. Since we're talking about shopping, for example, is how can an institution decide which accreditation body to pick? And this is an important piece. In other words, are they finding the alignment between what their purposes and goals are and what the accreditors are offering? So what we're trying to do is to survey and to get the perspective from institutions as well, to see if there is an alignment between all of the interviews that we conducted and the analysis that we conducted, and to see the institution's perspective, to see if there is sort of alignment or lack of alignment. And then this tool, doing that after, when we analyze it, and we will do validity study for it, so it would be also valid. In that case, it can be used in future for other institutions that want to decide which accreditor would fit their purposes, goals, and plans.
And I'll add to that and just say how interested I am to see that the institution's perspective on that, if there is a disconnect, and their as Wessam just mentioned, their readiness and their willingness or their interest in potentially looking at other accreditors. I think that could be really compelling. You know, accreditors were, as I mentioned, I mean, this two-way communication piece, so a lot of surveying, a lot of sort of individual contact. So they've surveyed every major accreditor, has surveyed their institutions. What I'm interested in is how well our survey aligns with their survey data. So is there, you know, are there different responses? Would you respond to your accreditor differently if you were asked, you know, as opposed to a third party? So I think that could be, you know, very interesting. The switch to accreditors, if this communication piece is really borne out on the organization, on the institutions, and if they feel more listened to or more heard, if they feel like there's a real fit, or if they're looking abroad. Yeah, I think this is a potentially rich vein of research that could be very informative across higher education, really.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that we all respect the importance of accreditation of our universities and also the peer review aspect of it. As you pointed out at the very beginning, this is not the government sanctioning, this is us reviewing ourselves, and so the institutions are really partners, as are their members. So with that, seeing no more questions in the chat, I just say, do you have any final comments you'd like to make? You kind of ended it really well here with what you're looking to the future.
Yes. Well, Wessam, would you like to begin? Any concluding thoughts? I certainly don't. Just to say thank you again for this opportunity. It's and how grateful I was to have Wessam come on as a co-PI of this. I really appreciated working with him throughout this study. Look forward to a phase 2 and learning. This was a really deliberate process. As a historian, I think we're more used to really just diving into a problem, and this was a very intentional, very deliberate methodology that Wessam helped inspire in this, and this sequential mixed method is really eye-opening and led to some really responsible, I would say conclusive results, and we've reached a point of saturation with the research and ready to move on to the next phase and so on and so forth. But every stage, as Wessam mentioned, was led by very deliberate, intentional, and methodical process. So I'm grateful for that, and I'll be grateful to the Office of Institutional Research and the Meter Fund for this opportunity.
And for me, I think it was a really good experience since we started this project, and the energy that Dr. Cousins, that always, it's so enthusiastic when we talk about accreditation, got me into this, and I was reading more into accreditation rather than I'm reading more into methods and research and evaluation. I was really excited because when we started talking about this, when Dr. Cousins had his fellowship and he had this experience with anecdotal data, now we are trying to get this anecdotal data, try to see it in practice. So it was really interesting that we're trying to get from what we heard to have concrete data and the application and implications in the future. So I think this is the beauty of this project, is how it started with some anecdotal data, and now we're seeing concrete data that either align or showing differences and show the implications. So that was a great project. It's still a great project that we're working on, and we appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, gentlemen, and we appreciate hearing about your work, and we look forward to seeing more of it. And just in conclusion, congratulations to the College of Arts and Sciences at Western Michigan University for demonstrating over the course of this year incredible research that's been done to address problems related to COVID-19. What we've learned is a lot of creative answers to difficult questions, whether we're talking about religious practices or accreditation. Also, I'd like to thank Dean Carla Koretsky for her support of her faculty and students in these projects. I imagine next year we will still be hearing more about COVID-19. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Have a wonderful day, and don't forget Giving Day here at WMU. Take care, everyone.